Good morning. There is a passage that I want to share with you before we read the passage for this morning, but I want you to kind of guess where this is coming from, and then, I'll go into the message itself. So, I don't know, a little quiz. Which book of the Bible does this come from? Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its full of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Can someone tell me where this passage is from? Anyone? Ecclesiastes, the first chapter of Ecclesiastes. It says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem, says, meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. And then the last verse, there are obviously other verses, but I stopped at the end of verse 9 where it says, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Seasons come, seasons go. So I want us to think about a little bit about my life, your life in some ways. And when we look at the world in which you and I live in, okay, and then hopefully if you remember the story of Ecclesiastes, we say that it is the son of David, king in Jerusalem, and we say that this is Solomon. So Solomon tried everything in the world. And then his conclusion is, there is nothing new under the sun, and everything is meaningless. So then we can conclude that life itself, right? Life itself is what? Meaningless. Somebody has done it, tried everything, and has concluded that everything is meaningless. But what I want you and I to think about and consider is this, because if some of you, I don't know whether you jump ahead or you look at the bulletin faithfully. We talk about the bulletin a lot of times. When I do the announcements, I said, oh yeah, well this week there's really nothing new. And then some people we share the announcement. And then 2 months later or a month later, they're like, oh, what are we doing? And then we're like, okay, I've been trying to announce it for the last month and a half, and you forgot, you weren't paying attention, But one of the things that you and I recognize is that the routineness of it all, right? And we're like, oh, we're back here. Sometimes, unfortunately, even in our Christian faith, because it's a weekly gathering together, sometimes we come and we're like, oh, this is pretty much the same, pretty much, there's nothing really new. And to be honest with you, in preparation for the message itself, and just even this morning, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, for me and for my family, we came in the December of 2007. So December of 2007, we came, and then because it was so close, the Cho, Elder Cho, their family came the first week of 2008. Okay, so 2007, I came maybe, I don't know, a week or two early. And then Elder Cho, because we were in a church we were together at a church right before this church. So 2007, 2008. So for me, it's 12 years. So, in about 2 months, it'll be 12 years. And then as some of you know, I don't know whether for those of you who are my Facebook friends, well, hopefully you're all, you didn't, disconnect me, or you didn't I don't want to hear his posts anymore and things like that. So if you're on my Facebook, you know that in September the 13th, Friday the 13th this year, right? Friday the 13th was my birthday, and I turned 56. And John, my son-in-law, turned 31 on Friday. For many of you, the young people, turned 31 on the 27th. So, I didn't recognize that. I didn't understand that when I was growing up. Time. The last, I don't know whether it was like this past week or the week before, I was driving with my wife because these days, because of her situation, we drive in the morning and then I have to pick her up after school. And the high school. So my daughter says a couple weeks, I think she said, "Oh, Dad, I'm going to my 10th high school reunion in November." I think it's in November. She says, "I'm going to my 10th high school reunion in a couple weeks or the next month." And then I'm thinking to myself, she graduated from high school 10 years ago. And then I'm looking at it, and the interesting thing is, I graduated from the same high school that she graduated from. But then I'm calculating the years, and I'm calculating the time, and I said, in 2021, my high school reunion will be 40th. 40th. Because I graduated high school in 1981. Sheldon High School class of 1981. I know some of you, the older people, they're like, so that's not a big deal. But some of the younger people, 1981, that means, oh my gosh, I wasn't even born, right? Some of you out there, you even have children, and you're like, oh, you is, as the term, you is old. You is old. And when you get older and older, what you realize is that what the son of David, king in his Jerusalem, when he says, meaningless, meaningless, and when their term in verse 9 was, there's nothing new under the sun. As you know, my wife and I were teachers. So I've been teaching. This is my 26th year. And then each year, every couple of years, we have this like professional curriculum, new. They'll say it's very new. We want to do something different. And then, a lot of the veterans, I'm only 26 years old, but some teachers have been teaching for 30 years or more. They'll be sitting there, it's like, that's 25 years ago they called it this. So now they kind of repackaged it, rebranded it, and then said it's something else. But then they said that teachers, we're very cynical people. Teachers, when teachers get together, the administrators, they say, you are worse than your kids because you want your kids to come up to the front, but all the teachers, nobody wants to go in the front. They're all sitting in the back. They have their cell phones out. They're sitting there, like some of them will have their laptops, and then, even the teacher union president will come up and say, teachers, can we be, respectful to the presenters, teachers, we complain all the time. It's like, why aren't you paying attention? Why are you on your phones? Like when I was at the high school, it's always like, why are you on your phones? Like, what are you looking at that's in between your legs that's so interesting? It's the phones and things. But then the teachers are like, that's nothing new. It's just something new, something repackaged, rebranded. But what I want you to think about is this. When the son of David, king in Jerusalem, says, meaningless, meaningless, I've done everything under the sun. To a certain degree, from the worldly sense, it is true. There is nothing new under the sun. And whatever is new under the sun, you and I know. You and I also have experienced it enough that even the younger kids, when they get a new toy, the new toy is coming, right? So, not yet, but it's like, in December, new toys will come up in September and October, right? And the kids will be like, oh, I have to have that new toy, I have to have that new toy. And for those of us who are a little bit older, we're like, how long did that newness last? It lasted, unfortunately, sometimes it's like not even a day, right? The day that they get the toy, it's broken, right? Mom, Dad, you bought me some, cheap, like fake-offs or something like that, and it's broken already. But you and I also have experienced and realized that there's really nothing new under the sun. But see, today's message that I want you and I to think about and focus on is this. Jesus, when he came 2,000 years ago, in a manger, 2,000 years ago when he came, and for 30 years, we say close to about 30 years, he lived in obscurity. No one really knew who he was, what he was doing. We just kind of assumed that because his father was a carpenter, he helped out his dad for about 30 years and just doing, woodworking, carpenter for 30 years. And then we say about 3 years of his ministry towards the end. Today's message, if you're paying attention to the bulletin, I wanted to share with you John chapter 13 and two verses, but I'll share with you the context where he said this, right? So if you look in your Bibles of John 13, verses 34 and 35, and with the Pew Bible that I have in front of me, that if some of you are following on this one, it's on page 802. And so in John chapter 13, two verses that I want to read for you and then share with you the meaning and the context and how we can hopefully change from these two verses. So in John chapter 13, Jesus says this, verses 34 and 35. He says, "A new command I give you." So he says, "I give you a new command. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." So Jesus, if you are looking, if you're looking at the Pew Bible, which I'm using, okay, you hopefully you remember that John chapter 13 is the chapter where Jesus, it says, "It was just before the Passover feast, and Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. And then, having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love." It says that he is showing the full extent of his love. And hopefully you remember in John chapter 13, what did Jesus do? They were about to have a meal together. And then, 2,000 years ago, people were walking around with, many times with just slippers, if they're wearing slippers or sandals and things of that nature. Very dirty on the outside. It's not asphalt concrete that we have. And so feet get dirty. And then so there's water, as you enter the room, there's water and there's towel. But they would, many times, if it was somewhat of an affluent family, they would have a servant there washing the feet of the people. But the disciples were in there, and it's like, if I wash my feet, should I wash somebody else's feet? But Jesus decides that he's going to wash his disciples' feet, right? So this is the chapter in chapter 13 where Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. I don't know about you, but we had this conversation in our family one time. It's like, whose feet would you be able to wash? Whose feet would you be willing to wash? When I was a youth director one time, we had a gathering of, I remember maybe about 100 students from 8 or 9 different churches. And then one of the youth group leaders said, "Hey, on the last night, let's wash our students' feet. Let's get these big basins, and then we'll fill it up with water, and then at the end, we'll have this little ceremony where we'll wash the students' feet." And I said, "That's fine." And but the interesting thing was some of the students were very hesitant. They were like, no, you can't wash my feet, you can't wash my feet. It was very uncomfortable. Think about it. So one of the questions and one of the challenges that I would throw out to you as you think to yourself, whose feet would I wash? And who would I allow to wash my feet too? Who would I be comfortable enough? And when we look in the earlier parts of chapter 13, you remember Peter himself said, "Oh, Jesus, why are you washing my feet? You are my master. You are my mentor. You're kind of like my master. How can you wash my feet?" And Jesus said, "Unless I wash your feet, you have no part of me." Who? And when we look at that scene, and as we've, many people have preached it, and I preached it, I believe at many times would be, is we talk about it as part of the humility, right? So when I look out, when I ask the parents, whose feet would you wash? Right? Our children, it's natural. For all the parents that are out there, moms and dads, one of the things we'd be like, washing somebody's feet is not a big deal, right? Because we love them. But then, some of the younger, let's say, not married people, changing diapers, I don't know about you, but the third one, our third child, I argue with my wife sometimes. With our third child, I changed the diapers more than you did. Okay? If it's we call it, number one, changing diaper is not a big deal. But number two, when it becomes a number two, and sometimes very quickly, very soon, it just stinks. Okay? And sometimes when it becomes a little messy. But the people that you and I are willing to do and to wash feet, symbolically and physically, they're the people that you know and I know that we love. And Jesus does that for his disciples. And then he says to them, just as I have done to you, you have to do it for other people, for the others. And he says, this is the new command. The new command I give you is that you need to love one another. One of the things that we talk about is, even in church, as I said, for your family, and relatives, it's a little easier to do. But if we were to okay, I know some people would be like, okay, let's not go there. But if I said to you, maybe in about 2 months, we should have a feet washing ceremony in our church. And then let's say we made it a weekday. How many of you would be willing to come and wash each other's feet? Okay? How many of you would be willing to come? And let's say we take turns. But you're not supposed to wash your family's feet, but somebody else's. That, I would think, and I would say, would be a little bit more difficult. But when we look at Jesus, he'd been, and you and I know also, it's very difficult. Because when we say that we're washing someone else's feet, we're, in a sense, that word humility and humiliation, right? It's from the same root, right? Humility, humiliation. If someone else is looking at me washing someone else's feet, what would they think of me? I'm beneath them. I'm lower than they are. That's why. Because it was the job and the responsibility of the servant. The masters and the leaders or the owners, they're the ones who would pay later on, hopefully, or whichever way that they were being paid. The servants are the ones that are washing feet. It's not the other way around. But see, our faith, your faith and my faith, the Christian faith, Jesus Christ, when he came, one of the verses that I like, when we take our youth group, years ago when I used to take the youth group to the inner city, I used to say to them on the first day, we are here to serve. Because Jesus said, the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. See, we live in the world, and we believe and we think that if we reach a certain, level of social, stature of whatever kind that it may be, whether it be money or power or position, that there are people who will serve me. And that is what the world seeks. But see, in Ecclesiastes, King Solomon, who was at the top of his money, power, and status, was at the top. He realized and he said, it's useless, it's meaningless, it's vanity. See, you and I, if we follow the way of the world, and we seek money, power, status, and whatever it is, and we expect someone else to serve us, it will never satisfy. Maybe for a short while. Maybe for a short while. Because when we look in the world, and when we look in world history, people had power. And with their power and with money or whatever else that they may have had at the top, you and I look around. How long does it last? How long will it last? Even the President of the United States in this time, let's say in the world of our modern history, we say that the President of the United States is the most powerful man in the world. Why? Because, we have the most powerful nation, army in the whole wide world. All the nuclear power that the United States, and the President is in control of that. So he is the most powerful man. But how many years does he get to be president? 4 years, at the most 8. And then if you're fine-tuning that, it could be one day less than 10 years. We can talk about that later. But for 2 terms is 8 years. That's how long it will last. And when we look at the presidents of the United States, how long does it last? How many of them are still alive? See, the world and its system and its goals, there is nothing new under the sun. But Jesus says, a new command that I give to you, love one another. The other thing, which I said that this was in the context of Jesus, washing the feet of his disciples. And it was near the Passover feast. There's another very simple section that I want to read for you. And we don't need to go there, but you remember hopefully when Jesus when they were having the Passover feast, when they're eating the bread and the wine, when Jesus institutes the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, right? Drink this. This is my body, this is my blood, right? The blood. And you know what it says in Luke 22:20? It says, in the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, he said, this cup is the new covenant. He said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. So, 2 words that I want you to remember. A new command that Jesus gave. And then when he instituted the Lord's Supper, and he with the bread and the cup, he says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. What we recognize, what we realize is as we look in the Bible and as we study the Bible, Jesus coming 2,000 years ago changes world history, right? The world is trying to change that in some ways, but for years and years, when the church was very influential to a certain degree, when we look when we do time, we say 4 BC, or right now we're in the year 2019 AD. BC means before Christ, and then AD means Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. So Jesus came 2019 years ago, but historically, when they recognized historically a little more, it turns out that Jesus was born somewhere between 4 and 6 BC, because they were not very accurate with the timing, the research. But when Jesus came, see, Jesus is making everything new. With the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, everything becomes new. So what is the old? The Bible that you and I have in front of us, hopefully you recognize and you realize that we say that the Bible has the Old Testament and the New Testament. See, a different word that we use for the Old and the New is there's the Old Covenant. What is the Old Covenant? The Old Covenant is from Genesis to Malachi. And then Jesus comes and Jesus institutes this new covenant in my blood. What is this new thing that changes and replaces the old? See, if you look at the Old Testament, one of the things that, for those of you who have read the Bible, hopefully at least more than once or twice, you recognize we say in the Bible, if you look in the Bible, we have history from Genesis all the way up to right before Psalms, right? Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, we say are the 5 books of poetry. And then when we go into Isaiah to Malachi, these are the prophets, the major prophets and the minor prophets. And so the books are organized in a certain way, historical, poetical, and then prophetics, with the major and the minor. But when we look in Old Testament, it is the history of what country? If we look in the Old Testament, it's the history of a nation. God chooses Abraham out of the Ur of the Chaldeans and takes him into Canaan. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob, his name changes into Israel. So Israel, God chooses a nation. God chooses a group of people. I will be your God, you will be my children, my people. So one of the things that, in preparation for the message, I'm thinking, when we look in the Old Testament, what are we looking at? See, God chooses a group of people, just one. And I was thinking to myself, why doesn't God choose 2 groups of people? You know what I mean? Maybe 3 groups of people. And then I'm thinking, that's a very, modern, futuristic thinking. For anyone who has done, let's say, business, if you put all your marbles in one business, what's going to happen? If you succeed, that's good. But if you fail, you just failed. So my thing always had been like, well, why don't you have like 2 or 3? So that if one fails, then hopefully the other 2 may succeed. But if we look in the Old Testament, God chooses one people, and he says, I will be your God, you will be my people. And then what does he give them? He gave them the 10 commandments in Exodus 20, right? And we see this people that God has chosen up and down, because after creation and within the fall, after the fall, but it is God's promise. Even when Adam and Eve committed their sin, that one sin, all human beings, you and I, we are born in sin. We talk about the original sin. From Adam and Eve, we're all descendants of Adam and Eve. And we are all born in sin. But even in the beginning, in Genesis chapter 3:15, God said, I will send someone who will crush the head of that serpent. So even in the beginning, there was a promise. So the Israelites are a promise that God is keeping his promise with these people. They're a chosen people. And then so from the Old Testament, what we recognize is that there are lots of examples that we learn from, yes. But when Jesus comes, Jesus says, no. Jesus says, I give you a new command. I give you a new covenant. And you know what that's based on? Jesus says, the blood and the body that I give you. It's a new covenant. It's a fulfillment. It changes everything. And what and how that changes is this. I had a very short conversation with one of my children about, when you're in church, you grow up in church, like we have Dad's Corner, right? And then you hear Bible stories. And then if you grow up in the church, what you do is what you recognize and what you understand is, well, that's what my parents believe, that's what my family believes, and that's what everybody at church believes, hopefully, right? And so that's what you think or that you believe. But when you go out into the world, when you and I, we go out into the world, especially starting, sometimes it's a little earlier, whether it be in, even elementary, because even my granddaughter goes to her elementary school, and she is talking about God with her friends, and her friend says, oh, you believe in God? I don't believe in God, right? But it gets a little bit more, serious, especially when you get to college. So when you get to college, they're like, do you believe in Christianity? How can you believe in Christianity? Look at the history of Christianity. And, they start questioning. And then you have to think to yourself, yeah, why do I really believe? Do I really believe? And then, we talk about comparative religion and all these things. But today, what I want you and I to think about, and for college, beyond, or whoever, when you're going out and people question and people say to you, well, how can you believe in Christianity? How can you believe in Jesus Christ? Today, when we focus on what Jesus said, I give you a new covenant and I give you a new command. And that command is love one another. See, our faith is the only faith that's based on the founder willing to and did and already was willing to sacrifice his life for you and me. So you think about any other religions, Buddhism, which is really obviously very big in Asia, what did he say? He said, find enlightenment. There's suffering in this world, which we all agree to a certain degree, because even the Ecclesiastes, Solomon said, meaningless, there's nothing new under the sun, there's lots of pain and things. We look at Job. And so Buddha says, if you follow the eightfold path, you will find enlightenment. No pain, nothingness, reach nothingness, and enlightenment. But unfortunately, do you know how he died? He went to his friend's house, and then he ate some poison mushrooms. And that's how he died. Any other religions that you think about it that you can think of? Muhammad. Okay? Right now, one of the biggest religions, obviously, in the Middle East and then just spreading out to the rest of the world. Okay, you look at the life of Muhammad. He died in old age, if I'm correct. He died in old age. But his life, if you look at his life, very bloody, in the sense that his followers, they had to protect themselves, yes, but, in defense, he had to murder other people and all, very violent. And even now, when we look at Islam, they'll say, oh, no, we're not radical Muslims. We love peace. But so much of it is radical because it's just radical. It's not a peaceful religion. And he didn't die for his people. But see, Jesus Christ is Christianity is the only religion where the founder said, my new command that I give to you is that you need to love one another. And then he bases that on the fact that even though I'm the founder, even though I'm your master, I'm willing to serve. I'm willing to wash your feet. And that's what he did for his disciples. And then that's what he says, love one another as I have loved you. One of my favorite Bibles in the New Testament, in 1 John, it says that we can love because he first loved us. You and I, we're just kind of sinful people. So it's like, if you tell me to do something, but you're not willing to do it first, what's the first word that comes out of our minds? We may not say it because we respect the person, but it's like, I remember a lot of times, they say that some of the coaches of sports will say, okay, do what I tell you, not what I do, right? Do what I tell you, not what I do. Don't worry about me, but you just got to do what I tell you to do. And then the first thing that comes into our brain is, if someone tells you to do something and they don't do it, they can't do it, what is it that, the first thing, I don't know about you, but the first thing that comes into my mind is, what a hypocrite. You don't want to say sorry, but you want me to say sorry? You don't know how to say sorry, but you want me to say sorry? Or you want, whatever it is, that when someone tells us and someone says to us, you do this, even though I can't do it or I don't want to do it, then we just like, hypocrite. But see, when we look at Jesus Christ, when he says, love one another, he says, as I have loved you, because I loved you first. And that is why it's the new command. So you must, and then there's this like command, because he says, so you must love one another. And then he says, by this everyone will know that you are my disciples. It's the only way that the non-Christians out there will know that we are disciples of Jesus Christ, if we love one another. If we can't love one another, we somehow, mistakenly believe that, these people, they're so unlovable, But maybe if it was a different people, it would be easier to love. But when I was doing youth ministry, in the beginning of my youth ministry, I would always say, see, you and I, we are the unlovables. If we really take a very close look at ourselves in our mirror, how lovable are we? There's this running joke between me and my wife, which is something just for me, and I know that it's somewhat of a reality to a certain degree, so I can't deny it somewhat. It's like when I look in the mirror, I'm like, you're still good looking, even though you have no hair and whatever it is. In Korean, there's a word for it. In our Friday night Bible small groups, we talked about it, kwang. You have what's called, in Korean, there's a word. So for the non-Koreans, there's a word I'll share with you. It's called chapok. What that means is you look at yourself and you're like, oh, you're in love with yourself. Very narcissistic. But I know, though on the surface, on the outside, that I may say, yeah, I have chapok, whatever it may be, but deep inside, when I know that I am an unlovable person. I can fake it pretty well for everyone else outside of my family. And that's what most of us, we are pretty good at it, right? No one knows the inner beings. And I'm very thankful many times when Chris will come up and preach and he'll say, how about Dad's patience? How patient am I? And he's very open with that. And he'll ask his kids, how patient is Dad? Because we know. We can fool most of the people outside, but when we're in the inner, we can't. See, how lovable are we, really? We really aren't. I'm really not. But yet, he did love me. See, we are the unlovables. He loved us first. He loved us. How much did he love us? he was willing to wash, and he did wash. And I can bet 100% that if I was one of the disciples, and you look at the disciples, the 12 disciples, right? In some ways, when we look at the 12 disciples, we're like, his disciple choosing was, in the humanly sense, was not that great, because he chose one who he knew. And then this is because it's scriptural and because it's biblical, but Jesus chose him because he knew that he was to be responsible for deceiving him. But would you pick someone knowing that they're going to deceive you, knowing that they're going to sell you out? And then even Peter, who said, Jesus, I will die for you, which is nice. But then Jesus said, no, you're going to deny me 3 times. You're going to deny me. And look, when we look at the disciples, they were not a great bunch of people that we would choose. They were not the smartest or the wisest or the best look. I don't know about looks, but it doesn't matter. But, they were not the people that we would think. But Jesus chose them. And then he discipled them. And because they recognized and they knew that Jesus loved them with an everlasting love, that he loved them first, that when he died on the cross, when he was resurrected, then they realized and recognized that this is true. It is true what he said to us the last 3 years. He is the Messiah that God promised that he would send through the Israelites, and he is the promised Messiah. And then because of Jesus Christ, as he said, a new command. The other thing that I recognize and that I understand and I want to share with you is this. Because of Jesus Christ, everything becomes new. The other thing that I recognize that I understood goes like this. Everything in the world that you and I have, it could be new for a year or two. Okay? In 2020, there's going to be like new cars that are going to come out. Someone mentioned like Samsung and Apple, they come up with what? New products every year, right? But then, like someone has said, like they're kind of a little refurbished somewhat, just changing of this or this or that. But they have to try to lure you with, it's new, it's new, it's new. Because you and I know that in this world, there is nothing new under the sun. But the other thing that I recognized in preparation for this message goes something like this. See, with Jesus Christ, everything is new. We get a new birth. Right? In John chapter 3, Jesus says, you need to be born again. That means my old life just changes. And I get a new birth, new spiritual birth. And that new spiritual birth, I can see Jesus Christ. I can see God. I have a relationship with God because he first loved me. And for whatever reason, he chose me before the foundation of the world. And everything becomes new from then on. The other thing that I recognized and that we recognize from the Word and the Scripture goes like this. See, you know how some people say, what's heaven going to be like? Are we going to be doing the same thing over and over again in heaven? But there's a truth that I want to share with you that you have to pay attention to this. See, in this world, there's a limitation of anything and everything. There's a limitation of our happiness. There's a limitation of our joy because a new car, a new house, whatever else that it may be new, sooner or later it becomes what? It becomes old. But see, in heaven, in Revelations 2, on the last chapters of Revelation, it says, a new heaven and a new earth will come. The other thing is, that newness does not stop. See, one of the things that I recognize and I understood from the Scripture goes like this. If you know God, see, God, Westminster Shorter Catechism, who is God? God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, unchangeable in his being, and all these things. But I want you to think about when we get to heaven, when we meet God face to face, when we see him, like you meet someone new and you're impressed. But then as you go, as you get to know them a little bit better, and then as you know their sinfulness, you're like, oh, you're just as sinful as I am, just in different ways. But see, God is so much different. You cannot compare, because God is infinite and eternal. The things that we will learn about God when we get to heaven, there will be no end. There is no end. Because there is no end to God. Do Have you ever thought about that a little bit? That there is no end to God. There is no end. Because if there is an end, that He's not God. So when we get to know Him, each and every day, each and every moment, there will be new things that we will learn about God and what He did, what He can do, why He did certain things, whatever questions that you may have. The endless, sometimes when you have a little kid, like when you're a teacher, sometimes you're in a classroom and you have a kid, asks a question, you answer the question, second question, third question, there are endless questions. I'm like, kids, stop asking questions. I got to teach the rest of the kids. Ask me later, during your lunch or whatever it is. Jesus Christ came, He gave us a new command. And the other thing is this. You remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 13? At the end, love is patient, love is kind. And then at the end, verse 13 of chapter 13 says this, and now these remain, faith, hope, and love. Do you know the end of that? And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is what? Do you know? But the greatest of these is love. And then someone explained it this way. See, when we get to heaven, we don't need faith anymore. You're like, why don't we need faith anymore? Because when we're in heaven, see, faith is already accomplished. See, we need faith in this world to believe, to have that faith. But once we're in heaven, we don't need that faith because we're in heaven. And then the second is says faith, hope, and love, right? Hope. Why do you not need hope when you're in heaven? Because you're already there. The hope that we have in this world is something, like our sinful self will somewhere say, tomorrow hopefully there'll be a better day, right? Each year, towards the end of the year, I tell my wife, I'm like, next year, I think things are going to change. Things are going to be a little better, a little whatever. And then my wife says, you say that every year. And she's correct. Because I think there's going to be something new, something different, but it's very little. Because I'm hoping that next year will be a little bit better than this year in some ways. But in heaven, see, we don't even need hope. Why? Because it's been achieved. It's been accomplished. We are already there. And that's why Paul says, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Because in heaven, what are we going to do in heaven? The thing that we will get to do in heaven is we will love completely. We will love Him forever and ever. We will love each other forever and ever. And that's what Jesus came to do 2,000 years ago. He said, a new command I give you, and the new covenant that I give you is love one another, because I've loved you first. Because the fathers planned it thousands of years ago, already when Adam and Eve loved them, but then they disobeyed Him and brought the fall on mankind. But Jesus came and said, I loved you with an everlasting love. So as I've loved you, so love one another. And as 1 Corinthians 13 says, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these, even in heaven, we will love God. What is the chief and the man? The chief and the man is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And that's what we are called to do. And that's what Jesus did for us as the example, the perfect example, because He is God Himself also. Let's pray. Father, we praise You and thank You for Your Son, who You sent 2,000 years ago.